Series looking at the life and legacy of three Irish men from politics, business and sport starts with the inheritor of a political dynasty, Brian Lenihan.
A lot of people have come up to me, you know, I'd be at events and are you the minister's chauffeur? And we used to kind of, no, I'm his armed protection officer, you know. Oh, sorry. But I often thought that if anything happened, he would be bigger and stronger than I was, you know, to protect me. I was one of the first couple of people that knew about his illness. Then he said, I'm going to have to go over now to tell the Taoiseach, Brian Cowan. So it was a fairly sombre drive across, you know, still very chatty and all that. Said, well, I'll keep doing my best as long as I can, you know. So that's exactly what he did. He kept going as long as he could.
In 2008, Brian Lenihan was surprised by the job he was given, but couldn't refuse. Lenihan became finance minister as the property bubble burst and Ireland fell into recession. No one was left untouched. Then, in the darkest days, Brian Lenihan faced his own personal crisis.
There's a growth there that isn't going to do me any good, so I'll have to beat that growth.
He didn't believe that he was going to die. I think he had his father's optimism.
This was a real challenge of the job, and then was a challenge of fighting for his life. His mind was crystal clear, sharp as a razor.
He called me up shortly after I'd been on the radio. He said, I can't disagree with what you've said. I said, you certainly can't, because it's the truth.
You have now accused me of corruption on the floor of this house. How dare you?
Brian could do outrage as well as most barristers can do outrage.
That he was thinking of the leadership of Fianna Fáil at a time when his illness was so advanced would lead you to have some doubts about his state of mind at the time?
You don't run away from difficult situations. It's hard to explain that to people today.
It has been an extraordinarily difficult election.
Don't ask me what drove him. It was something special. It was something very, very different.
Brian Lenihan was born in 1959. He lived in Athlone with his family until he was 12. In those days, he was known as Brian.
I love it. I see a lovely family, a happy family. All little boys playing in the snow with their mum and dad. And Brian with his little short pants to his knees, as little boys wore then. Mark with a little impish face on him before he ever got ill. Connor with a snowball in his hand, ready to throw it at anybody.
Myself and Brian, we would have started school together at 4 years of age. We would have started off probably playing Cowboys and Indians, and as we got a bit older we realised football was their soccer, so we probably turned our Cowboys and Indians into soccer teams.
We were looking for somewhere to kick football, and Lenihan's lawn was lovely and flat, and we started to gravitate over towards their lawn.
I think sarcastically we used to call the house the White House, but it was painted white, so that was an obvious name for it, you know. We probably didn't realise what was going on. When you were 6, 7, 8, 9 years of age, it didn't make any difference if the father was a minister or whatever, you know.
Well, I do quite a lot of it. Every weekend I'm home.
Brian's father, Brian Lenihan Sr., was a rising star in Fianna Fáil.
I spend the week until Friday in Dublin, and then the weekend is constituency work.
Sean Lemass appointed Lenihan to Cabinet as Minister for Justice when he was only in his mid-30s.
Mr. Gavin there himself, he is. How are you doing?
Good ball. Good play. Oh, good football at Athlone.
Soccer football was huge in the town of Athlone. My father had played football at a semi-professional level for both Athlone and for Bohemians, and my father was perhaps more interested in football than he was in politics, to be quite honest with you.
Brian Jr. was a huge soccer fan, So he got his classmates and we formed a club called East End United.
Well, I think he knew he wasn't the best soccer player around. He wasn't hugely sporty in instinct, but he loved sport at the same time. So I think he saw himself as managing the team.
He would have been enthusiastic, is probably the word we use nowadays. But there was no scouts coming down from Dublin teams looking at him. He tried his best, though, God love him.
I was the bag boy and I was the sort of assistant groundsman, I think was the title. Brian was good at giving out titles.
For a young man, I thought him very old. I did think that. I thought that he was old beyond his years.
A family tragedy added to Brian Jr.'s early maturity. His brother Mark fell ill and died of leukemia, aged 5.
Anne just noticed him getting tired and getting a cough and cold, and then he was diagnosed, and again there was the feeling of disbelief. We kept thinking he would get better, but of course he wasn't to be.
He was a real pal, if you like, that he played with. Brian would be quite emotional when he spoke of Mark, and he would try to tell me about him, what kind of child he was. It gave him a sense of, I suppose, vulnerability and insecurity about life itself. So I think may have made him slightly more cautious, made him very protective of me as a brother, and I really appreciated that.
We have you down as 48% of the poll last time, 45% this time.
The general election in 1973 was a turning point for Brian Lenihan Sr.
The next time I will be really back at the head of the poll.
The setback of losing his seat in Roscommon Leitrim prompted a rethink. Lenihan moved to a new constituency in the growing suburbs of West Dublin. It was a big move for all the family, but especially Brian Jr.
Dad had very distinctive wavy hair, if you remember, and Brian didn't have that, but he did have a big mop of dark hair, and he had certain facial characteristics. He was a bit like his dad, yeah. I never heard him saying, I will go into politics.
I think his mind was very set on becoming a lawyer, but I think what happened was that he became exposed to politics, student politics in college, but then I think real politics in the clinics that he did for my father when my father became ill.
Mr. Lenihan suffering from a blood disorder, hemochromatosis.
From 1987, Brian Lenihan Sr. battled a serious liver condition. He never allowed illness to limit his work as a government minister or his optimism.
I've lost 4 stone in weight. I'm very happy to have lost it. And all the medical fellows say that I'm on even keel. And
Brian Lenihan Sr., when he had liver disease, he didn't stop. He is quoted himself as saying at the time, I was dying and I knew it, but I had to put on the bravado.
So I hastened to reassure them that I was alive and well and would be around again at the next election.
Brian Sr.'s determination kept him going to the very end. 20 years on, his son would draw on similar qualities when facing his own crisis.
My title was personal secretary. For the likes of me, it was very, very important to work very hard in an election campaign because I need Brian to be elected for me to keep my job.
But first tonight, the fight in Dublin West for the late Brian Lenihan's seat. It's impossible at this stage to predict any clear winner. A 4-seater constituency.
The death of Brian Lenihan Sr. led to a by-election in Dublin West. Brian Jr. was chosen as the Fianna Fáil candidate.
He was uncomfortable with people. He couldn't engage, he couldn't look somebody straight in the eye. You always got the impression when you were talking to Brian that his mind was elsewhere. He would be looking over your shoulder at somebody else. And I initially thought, you know, this guy, if he ever decides to run for election, it'll be interesting to see how he manages.
The coverage in the newspapers at that stage were saying that Bertie was under pressure. He'd only been appointed 12 months previously. Was he going to be able to deliver? He was appointed because he was a Dublin-based TD. So this was a by-election in Dublin. It had to go well for the party leader.
With a total of 13 people standing, the vote will be highly fragmented. With the
It's like every race, you look at their riders and runners, and it was clear where the opposition was. I mean, Joe Higgins was going to be the opposition. And with Brian, if Brian was the candidate coming from the Castleknock area, well, we were going to do well in that area. The problem was how we were going to do in all the working class areas out into Lanchestown, Mulhuddard.
The water charges are one of the top issues in the campaign.
Well, I think that Brian Lenihan was a very safe candidate for the establishment. Bertie Ahern wanted to be the major leading party in the general election, which was coming into view, and therefore they put enormous resources into that by-election.
He was so full of ideas, and I said, the candidate is going to be a handful. I said to him, you're no longer Brian, now you're Brian for this election campaign. No, I'm Brian. That's what everybody knows me as. I said, Brian, the electorate don't give a feck what your name is. You're Brian, that's your father's name. They'll recognise that.
Brian was difficult, you know, to be honest. I mean, I've seen it over the years. I mean, the more intellectual they are, the more work they don't want to do. You have to do both. You have to be able to put in the graft, and keep lunches to the minimum, and keep tea to the minimum, and keep finishing time late. And that required a discipline, which he hadn't got at the time.
But in Neilstown, the issues are drugs, poverty and lack of basic...
We had to get him to knock at doors, you know, other than Castleknock.
This is the heartland of the hard left. Here the Workers' Party, Militant Labour and Sinn Féin can all expect...
There were a lot of people who thought, oh, absolutely, he's a shoo-in, no doubt about it, he's Brian Lenihan's son. We did not buy into that at all. There was a lot of tension coming towards the end of that campaign that, you know, maybe he might not do this because Joe Higgins was really mounting a very, very strong campaign.
We can defeat the parties who have not represented the interests of our people.
I'd be delighted if the people did me the honour of electing me. It's a tough fight for the party here.
Because of the swing to Joe Higgins, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael agreed on a vote transfer pact between candidates. Brian Lenihan's hope was that transfers would get him over the line.
First count results giving Brian Lenihan the edge by...
It was really late in the day that the new transfer pattern between Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil emerged, and that changed the situation.
Brian Lenihan was only 250 votes ahead of Joe Higgins on first preference. Now, a Fianna Fáil candidate, 250 votes ahead of the opposition, with 12 other candidates, you would expect that was curtains. Brian Lenihan, the whole way up, got votes from people of all parties and no parties.
And accordingly, Lenihan is deemed to be elected.
When Brian Lenihan was declared the winner, you had Bertie Ahern arriving then in a great flurry at the election count to make sure that that by-election victory was notched up to him.
We're champions tonight, Fianna Fáil are champions.
He told me himself that he spoke to his father that morning, that he went for a walk the morning of the count and had a little chat with his father, and, you know, win, lose or draw, he was kind of happy enough that he had a little chat with the father.
Thank you, people of Dublin West. I'll work very hard to represent you in all areas.
I think he was extremely proud of the fact that he'd held the seat. That was his big tribute to his father. Once he did that, he was able to rest, relax and become the new Brian Lenihan, but in his own right.
Democracy will triumph!
I'd be from the 60s era with rock and roll, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And Brian loved classical music. He had these 3 CDs of big Welsh male voice choir. He used to turn it up really loud in the car, and he used to sing along with the chorus. And he'd be explaining to you, now listen to this part, Shay, it's building up now, and the conductor does this or does that. He'd look over at me, you know, isn't that great, Shay? And I said, oh yeah, Brian, that's musicians, they're great musicians, you know. And I'd be at the hand controls over my side, turning it down. But That's the kind of music he loved.
And I said, come on, Brian, everybody has a favourite pop song. And he said, honestly, I don't listen to pop music. I never have. I'm a classical music fan. I can tell you my favourite piece of classical music. Now, that in Bertie Ahern's Fianna Fáil was quite extraordinary. And Bertie didn't like Brian Lenihan, and he didn't like the fact that he played Wagner in the car and knew about art. And I think it was one of the reasons that he didn't promote Brian earlier than he did. But there definitely was a middle-class, bourgeois self-confidence about Brian Lenihan Jr., which was totally unapologetic, and that was rare in Fianna Fáil.
Lenihan plus 1,056.
Brian Lenihan held his seat in the 1997 general election, which also brought Fianna Fáil back to power. His ambition and ability were evident, but promotion under new Taoiseach Bertie Ahern was slow in coming.
I think it was a huge frustration to him and also to myself and many others during the period of leadership of Bertie Ahern that he was rather conservative when it came to promoting first-time deputies.
It was when I made him Minister of State for Children's Affairs in 2002. He would definitely like to be in the cabinet then. He saw that 5 years was long enough to be, chairman of a high-profile committee, that he should have been a minister.
The Minister, Mr. McDougall, said
he wanted to be Minister for Justice, and I told him on another day.
Bertie Ahern saw a difficulty in ever being able to control Brian Lenihan Jr. at Cabinet. Brian Lenihan Jr. was strong as a person, as an orator, as a leader himself. And he came with so much history in the Lenihan name that once you were to lose that, you could lose control of the party very quickly. And I don't think Bertie Ahern ever wanted that around the Cabinet table.
This guy was just of a calibre that he deserved to be put on a fast track to Cabinet Office. In part, it was a sense often in Fianna Fáil that, hold on now, you have to bide your time, young man, and just because you're the son of, you don't get any fast track.
You'd have heard him giving out occasionally about Bertie and saying, it wasn't fair or he was too conservative. I mean, I think I would have said the same myself about Bertie as well.
I know outside people said that he roared and shouted. Brian was not like that. His brother maybe. And there were other people who had been senior counsels for 20 years who were not getting the position. And that brings home a certain reality that you're not the only good boy in the class.
In spring 2008, storm clouds were gathering over the global economy.
Brian Cowen's new cabinet finally arrived.
In Ireland, a new Taoiseach and a new government were settling into office.
Newly elected Taoiseach Brian Cowen.
They were all happy that day. We were all happy. And they tripped down as lightly as they could with their big sizes down the steps and into their allotted places.
Coming into the key portfolio of finance is Brian Lenihan.
And I remember feeling, finance, there will be difficulties.
If your ministers fall down, we will relentlessly pursue them.
It was a huge surprise to Brian himself. He didn't really expect to be made Minister of Finance at that particular time, or at any time.
And I have the misfortune to have become Minister for Finance a few weeks ago as the building boom was coming to a shuddering end.
By September of that year, property prices had fallen sharply, and the Irish banks were in danger of running out of cash.
Department of Finance and financial regulator and the central bank, the three key players, were in effect managing a scheme of denial that the problem was developing, denial that the problem was structural, that there was an issue of solvency in the Irish banks.
They sat on their hands all summer until it was too late.
All of that preparatory work should have taken place in spring, summer 2008, and it did not take place.
Good morning at 7 o'clock.
This was the morning Ireland awoke to dramatic news.
Breaking news this morning, a bailout for the banks, not in the US, but here. The government has guaranteed all the bonds.
The plan was to avert a bank failure. The cost to the state would only emerge later.
It was going to be the cheapest little guarantee in the world.
As soon as the deal was announced, the Irish market roared ahead.
And the theory for a while, in that early September, was that it was a magic bullet But, you know, the magic bullet was heading straight back into the heart of Ireland.
If you're proposing to hand over the deeds of the country to bail out the banks.
He was being told that, okay, there might be some losses in the banks, but nothing very big. He wasn't being told, we don't know what the losses could be. They could be very, very large, and we should put a system in place that protects the state. That wasn't part of the discussion that he was briefed on, and he didn't have the background to really appreciate those risks.
I can tell you, if funds are not secured by the Irish banks, it will be a very, very serious matter for economic life in this country.
He was horrified at times. A little bit later than the bank guarantee, he said to me, the information I have, I'm not sure whether it's right or not. And he says, I don't know whether they're trying to fool me or whether they know what the hell is going on in their own bank. And that's the turmoil that was there at that particular time.
The guarantee was inevitable. And that inevitability, I think Brian Lenihan understood. And he understood also the gravity of that inevitability as well.
Speaking this afternoon,
the tremendous amount of stress that has to place onto you, knowing that which is inevitable is not optimal, knowing that which is not optimal is disastrous and extremely painful to the country. And I think he did know that.
The government has decided to abolish the automatic entitlement to a medical card for those over 70.
Middle-income families have been mugged by the minister.
You have made decisions today that will threaten to turn a recession into a depression.
About a quarter of economic activity in Ireland was lost in a very short period of time. You know, he seemed very stoical, but being a Lenihan, he always injected into his budget speeches an air of confidence and optimism.
Ceann Comhairle, it is no less than a call to patriotic action. It is my great honour to commend this budget to the House.
I remember him using quotes like, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." I think he was probably intelligent enough and acute enough to know that it wouldn't be enough.
One night, not long after the budget, there was a lot of people protesting around Merrion Street. The main entrance was the Taoiseach's entrance where the fountain is. People will know that. We came out a different entrance. And as we were coming out, they spotted the car and they ran towards the car. The only time that I feel that Brian was a tiny bit scared to think that the Irish people would turn on him. Now, we had a Mercedes and I drove away at, good speed and well clear. But Brian, in that instance, just couldn't fathom. He says, they're going to kind of get me, All his life, him and his father was held in very high esteem. And the idea that his own Irish people would try and get at him, that upset him a bit.
Hello, men. Well, we have a great show of medical begging today, haven't we?
The Lenihan tie to Fianna Fáil goes back 3 generations to the Irish Midlands. Brian Jr.'s grandfather, Paddy, supported Michael Collins in the Civil War.
Is Joe here too? Yeah.
Later, his loyalty to Sean Lamass won him over to Fianna Fáil.
Look at this, look at this.
The family has been a force to reckon with, both in the party and in government, for over 50 years. Brian Lenihan's life and political legacy was shaped by this inheritance, and especially by his father, Brian Sr.
Certainly they did share that elusive Lenihan charm. They both had it in buckets. They presented themselves somewhat differently. Brian Sr., a man of the 1950s, Middle Ireland, ebullient and flamboyant. Brian Jr., the Belvedere boy from the East Coast, kind of more careful, more guarded in how he presented himself.
Brian Lenihan Sr. was always a man who wanted to hide what his own ability was. And I think he did that for a number of reasons. One was he never wanted to get into direct conflict and threat with other people about his own ambitions for leadership or anything else. He was also an incredibly loyal man, and for Brian Lenihan Sr., the party came before everything. And if he was asked to do something, even if he disagreed with it, if it was for the good of the party, the good of the leader, he would do it.
I think in both cases, Brian Sr. and Brian Jr., the loyalty to the party held them back, probably beyond the time that they should have made the move.
They were always up there, beloved by so many in the party and all of that, and yet there seemed to be this jinx on both of them at the end. Brian Jr., not even approaching his prime, suddenly cut down. Compare them to the Kennedys, who flew so close to the sun, and then tragedies that befell them.
He actually rang me and told me. Actually, I remember it was Friday the 13th of November. He said to me, they think I might have cancer. And I said, oh, where? It's the obvious question you ask. And he said, oh, the old pancreas. And he knew.
Stephen's Day, people were saying, TV3 are doing a special news bulletin this afternoon, and there's some suggestion it has something to do with Lenihan.
The gossip machine is good, so I heard about it before it broke. And I just thought about Brian. I thought Brian and his wife and his kids.
I rang him. He was quite shaken. One of the few times I kind of felt flashes of anger for him about being put in a position of having that day or those days to sit down and tell his immediate family before it broke.
I felt he was the correct person for that job at that time. I felt he had the back for the burden, if you like. But when he got his diagnosis, I remember thinking, this is too, this is terrible.
The cancer diagnosis was the worst possible news for a government already under siege.
The important point is there's no incapacity intellectually or mentally.
He'll need chemotherapy and possibly radiotherapy.
I know that he did give some thought when he got the diagnosis to giving up. One has a sense that all through his education, his years in Trinity, even his political education, he was preparing himself to do something useful and significant in the national interest when he got the opportunity to.
He would have seen Dad battling illness in the public eye, and I think he thought it probably wasn't that unusual thing to be doing,
The diagnosis of the pancreatic cancer was clearly a personal disaster for him, but it had very serious implications as well for the government. Brian Cowen did have to think carefully as to what he should do. He didn't want to be the man who sacked a sick man from a job that he wanted to keep. But maybe if Brian Cowen had been stronger in the situation, he would have said, I'm very sorry about what's actually happening to you. I wish you the best in your treatment, but I need somebody in the Department of Finance who's in the whole of their health.
I was quite doubtful that he would be able to continue. He did conceal the extent of the treatment that he had to have and the extent of the tiredness, and yet he stayed focused.
First of all, I'd like to welcome Commissioner Ollie Wren to Ireland.
At times I felt he was almost more focused because his whole life was about the treatment and the job. And that was a huge sacrifice. I mean, I think people hopefully will understand and appreciate the sacrifice it was.
He dealt with his illness in a manner that was absolutely astonishing. He asked his consultant what would be the best reference books to get to learn about this. So he got these reference books and he learned about pancreatic cancer. And he developed his own diet, foods that the cancer didn't like. He discovered the cancer didn't like oxygen. So he would go for these big long walks after his chemo. He knew there was no cure, but all he wanted to do was buy time.
Mr. Lenihan was given a rousing reception.
In 1990, Brian Lenihan Sr. was a popular choice as Fianna Fáil's candidate for the presidency. Brian Jr. helped with his father's campaign. The election would test Brian Sr.'s loyalty to party leader Charles Haughey.
I intend to meet as many people as possible in every county of Ireland. That schedule was examined by my medical advisors who said splendid.
The previous year in the United States, Brian Sr. had undergone a life-saving liver transplant. Now, with his health restored, Lenihan took an early lead in opinion polls.
He was heading for 48% of the vote on the opinion poll. It was as sure as a horse gone over the last fence. He could not be beaten.
I don't want to start claiming victory at this stage. The people have to make up their minds fully, and it's their opinion at the end of the day that will count.
But dramatic news of a recorded interview brought the bandwagon to a halt. On tape, Lenihan described his efforts in 1982 to contact President Hillary about the dissolution of Dáil Éireann. Lenihan denied this, insisting his earlier recollection was incorrect.
Nor did I speak to him, and I've confirmed that that is the correct position.
As the interview progressed, I suddenly noticed that Brian was talking over my shoulder. For a moment, I didn't realise that there was a camera coming from behind my shoulder, and that Brian was talking to the camera.
Sean, I can explain this fully. My mature recollection, which I'm giving to you now, I did not ring President Hillary on that night. I did not speak to him.
Lenihan's direct appeal to the electorate was a last chance to save his credibility.
When it was over, we were still live on air. I had to read into the next item. Up it came, and I was able to turn around to Brian and shook his hand and thanked him. And he held my hand for a moment, and he just slowly shook his head. He knew. He knew that the whole thing was an unmitigated disaster.
Did he offer his resignation, Mr. Hogan?
Taoiseach Charles Haughey was under pressure from his coalition partners, the PDs. He demanded Brian Lenihan's resignation as Taoiseach and Minister for Defence. It was a tough call. Lenihan was a trusted friend.
Brian, he always understood the political game, so he would have understood what Haughey had to do to save a government, but at the same time there was a personal feeling there that, loyalty should be shown. The night he was asked to resign, he came down to Athlone. The streets were full and the crowd were howling, no resignation. And that has to have hurt, knowing that the membership of Fianna Fáil wanted him, but that the boss was doing the expedient thing.
Sacked and humiliated by Haughey, Brian Lenihan picked up the pieces of his presidential campaign.
As far as I'm concerned, it is full steam ahead in the presidential campaign.
We have a week now to get out to the public and do all we can to get Brian Lenihan elected.
We got up with the campaign the following morning, and on we fought, and we put in one hell of a fight, and I think he was very proud at the end. I was with him every hour of every day, part during the night, and we put in as a good a campaign as any totally healthy, fit person would have.
Brian almost pulled it off. He headed the poll, but he fell down on transfers, and Mary got over the line. That Duffy tape was the great game changer, not just in terms of the presidential election. It was a game changer in Brian's life. Ever after that, everything went wrong for Brian, not just politically, but in his personal life, health-wise. It was all downhill from there.
Did he love Charlie Haughey as much after all of that? Would he not have liked to see the PDs go down on it? I think he would have been happier. I mean, everyone is human. But did he go around grumping and griping like most politicians would? No, he didn't.
Brian Sr.'s loyalty to his leader won him huge regard in the party. But the private memory of a very public betrayal remained.
I was terribly anxious that he would come that particular year because I felt his time was marked. And I expect other people must have felt that too. For some people, it is difficult to get past their belief that because they belong to the Fine Gael party, Fianna Fáil is not entitled to have a say on somebody like Michael Collins. Michael Collins does not belong to any particular political party in Ireland. He belongs to the people of Ireland. I felt in 2010 it had to be now or never.
I'm here representing the Taoiseach and the government. Full honours have been given by the Irish Army to the founder of the Irish Army, Michael Collins.
In 1990, Brian Lenihan Sr. broke with tradition to attend the centenary celebrations of the birth of Michael Collins.
He must have been nervous because who knows, there's always somebody who might throw an egg or something like that.
Give a warm cock welcome to our guest speaker, Minister Brian Lenihan.
20 years later, Brian Lenihan Jr. became the first Fianna Fáil minister to deliver the official oration at Bailnham Law.
It was a beautiful, beautiful sunny day. It was a cloudless blue sky. I know you read that in books and you say, was it really cloudless? Well, it was. And the excitement was mounting right throughout all that period, and the crowds were coming more and more. And they would have all been aware, because he had diagnosed himself publicly on RTE radio. And I suppose that added to the curiosity. And Brian spoke.
I've been rereading some of Collins's biographies and historical analysis of his career. You must forgive me if I say I took a particular interest in his work as Minister for Finance between 1919 and 1922.
He'd a very funny piece that he had looked at all the portraits on the walls of his office of all the ministers for finance, and he said the best looking was Michael Collins.
He's the youngest, and I dare say by a long stretch the best looking of us all.
And that got a woohoo, as you can imagine, from the audience. Their man was the best looking.
It was a hugely important invitation for him, and he saw it as a very, very significant event in his life, and he made that completely clear to me.
He had a rapport with people. They physically took hold of him, and they wouldn't let him go.
He was absolutely relieved, delighted, in a sense overwhelmed by the warmth of the response that was there and the genuine affection that everybody showed him on the day.
He looked wonderful. He stood tall and strong. That was the day we dared to hope. We did really.
By mid-November 2010, pressure on the state finances was at breaking point. Officials from the Department of Finance were in preliminary talks with the EU about a bailout for Ireland. But the government's official line was denial.
The fact that we were not involved in negotiations, and we're still not involved in negotiations.
The Irish state is fully funded into the middle of next year.
He hadn't communicated, and I didn't know that, he hadn't communicated with his political colleagues, and that, of course, left a lot of, I'm sure, unhappy feelings.
Well, I'm not aware of it, nor is Noel, and I've spoken to Brian Lenihan today.
The only words I uttered during the whole thing was when Dermot Ahern says to me, we'd have to have a government decision on this, and we have no government decision on it. Isn't that right, Noel? And I said, yeah, that's right. When we were told then that this was the only option that we had, we were obviously felt that we hadn't been given the full story at the time. We made that known.
Nothing from Mr. Lenihan on the way in.
Brian Lenihan himself believed that negotiations did not happen till he walked into a room with other political leaders. And if the EU were sending over some officials to talk to his officials, that wasn't negotiations, that was preparing the groundwork for the big head-to-head that was yet to come. But he found in that week that the EU did outplay him.
So are we then talking about a loan?
It is a loan, yes.
And you can confirm that they will be giving us a loan?
If it's agreed, of course.
Patrick Honohan, fair dues to him, told the Irish people this morning what your Taoiseach failed under questioning yesterday to tell this House.
And then everybody said, isn't the governor a very straightforward man? He just says it as it is. And the media picked that up and said he was wonderful, he was straightforward. I had a sort of a bit of a different impression.
He called me up, of course, shortly after I'd been on the radio. He said, with a kind of tone of exasperation, I can't contradict you. I can't disagree with what you've said. I said, you certainly can't, because it's the truth. He hadn't really any answer. He was quite down about the whole programme as it had been negotiated.
A programme of assistance for Ireland totalling €85 billion has been agreed.
Particularly when the prospect of some kind of burning of bondholders was floated by some of the people on the other side of the negotiations and then taken away.
The interest rate is set at 5.8%.
He felt that he had failed to deliver a good product in this negotiation. So that was, I'd say, the low point in our relationship.
For months, Brian Lenihan had been privately critical of Brian Cowen's leadership. In public, he continued to toe the line of loyalty.
He is the elected leader of the party. He's also the Taoiseach. At this stage, he's the only person who can lead Fianna Fáil into the election. I haven't had time to organise a coup or a challenge in the last year.
That was most ill-advised, and I think I would have made it very clear to him in a very a robust way that this was really the last thing he should have been doing.
Why?
Because it would have cost him the opportunity which he was seeking, which was to be leader of the party.
He felt his father missed out on an awful lot and could have been leader but wasn't, and I think that was his ultimate aim. He had this problem always with the loyalty he wanted to show, and he seemed always torn between a decision to take that would help him or torn between the ultimate loyal path that his father took. There are times when you have to be the one wielding the knife as well.
Brian Cowen won a crucial vote of confidence from the Fianna Fáil parliamentary party, but after a botched attempt to reshuffle his cabinet, he bowed to the inevitable.
I have decided on my own council to step down as Uachtaráin Fianna Fáil and leader of Fianna Fáil.
Brian Lenihan could now show his hand. Despite illness, he was determined to be leader of Fianna Fáil.
Many of you see me as the strongest challenger to Micheál Martin, and the longer this debate goes on, the more confident I am that I will win it.
That he was thinking of the leadership of Fianna Fáil at a time when his illness was so advanced would lead you to have some doubts about his state of mind at the time. And if that was what he was applying to his personal life or his personal ambition and what he wanted for Fianna Fáil, would it also not then raise questions about his judgment in relation to issues for the country?
The only reason he considered that was, could he give a better result in the short term, because it was clear that the election, the Greens had more or less said earlier on that we're going to pull out.
It took just an hour to choose Brian Cowen's successor. The 8th leader of Fianna Fáil had a commanding majority.
I think that at the time that if there was going to be a challenge had to be far earlier than that. The die was cast for everybody at that stage, and it was a bit of a hopeless case.
A small craft warning is in operation as winds are forecast to reach storm force.
I remember going out and canvassing and thinking that it was very tough on him, that electioneering in a February election contest was very tough on an ill man. I remember thinking, God, he's great to be doing this at all,
Big names in Fianna Fáil retired rather than contest the 2011 general election. But for Lenihan, there was only one choice.
While Conor Lenihan lost his seat and his aunt Mary O'Rourke.
I know people who said maybe you'd be better off not standing like those other people who had decided to retire rather than face the electorate, but that wasn't really an option for me or for him. We felt we had a long kind of immersion in the party through my father and through the family, and also a long, if you like, immersion of loyalty, that you don't run away from difficult situations. That's the way he was brought up, and that's the way we were brought up. It's hard to explain that to people today.
The election was a nightmare for the government parties. Brian Lenihan's first preference vote was halved. Then, on the final count, he made it over the line.
He did get elected in the end, and I rang him to tell him that he had been elected. So it was my great pleasure to do that. And he came up and he got a big cheer and a big clap when he arrived, and it was very emotional. It was very emotional.
It has been an extraordinarily difficult election, and I appreciate the huge pain and hurt that many individuals and households have suffered.
I remember feeling great happiness for him that he had retained his seat in the midst of this wipeout for the party more generally across Dublin. And I remember thinking, well, that's terrific. He, of anyone, really deserves to keep his seat.
Bear in mind, he was the only
Fianna Fáil TD to hold his seat in Dublin, and a load of politicians love the idea that they have a personal vote. Actually, elections show otherwise. When the tide is out for your party, you lose with them, and I think that did prove that he was one of the few people who really did have a personal vote in the constituency.
Oh, he said, would you believe I'm only out of bed? And I slept a great sleep, and I want to go back to bed. I feel tired already. And I said to him on the phone, trying to put on my cheerful face, you know the line in Shakespeare, sleep knits up the ravelled sleeve of care. And he said, yes, yes, say it again, Mary. And I said, sleep knits up the ravelled sleeve of care. And he said to me, you were always a great teacher. And of course, that made me, I remember crying when I put up the phone after him.
Normally we would have a get-together, we'd have finger food or whatever, but on this occasion Brian wanted a dinner. And we had to have everybody there, whoever worked on any of Brian's campaigns. He said to me, we won't call it a victory party, we'll call it a thank you party. He knew this was it. He knew it was the last speech he would make. And after the speech, he sung The West's Awake from the stage. And he was a shadow of himself at the time. And it was pretty haunting, actually.
Which of us can see inside the head of somebody who's had not only a cancer diagnosis, but a fatal cancer diagnosis? I mean, he was writing a 4-year plan, which we now have seen. Credit to the current government because they implemented large chunks of it, has worked. But at the time of writing it, you had a man doing that in the national interest, knowing that what he was proposing in it was shredding his own political reputation.
Brian Lenihan will be remembered as the Minister for Finance who acceded to the pressure from the European political and economic establishment to bail them out on the shoulders of ordinary working people. That will be the cold judgment of history.
I think he will be seen favourably. I think he was very quick to start the fiscal adjustment that was going to be necessary as the property bubble burst. And that will become more and more evident in the historical record.
He was a politician who knew how to promise things to people. And he was like his father in the sense that he would be able to fix problems for you. He may not have been able to fix the problems, but he created the confidence. He at least gave people some hope that things would be sorted out.
He did his very best in a dreadful, dreadful situation. And in a way, he was the one shining light at a time when every other member of Cabinet seemed to be confused, didn't seem to know what was going on. He kept his cool.
He played the best hand of cards that he could. He really did show grace under fire, and I think that sense of courage was a hugely attractive element of him.
It was all his stuff there, and he's not there. Everybody came up and helped, and we just shut the place down. We had Brian Lenihan TD constituency office in the window, and Brian loved this, so that had to come down. So I took it off myself with a hairdryer, and it was heartbreaking. It was absolutely heartbreaking. Very sad for him that a guy of his age would get this awful disease with the amazing future that he had. I have no doubt that he would have been party leader at some point. I'm sad for him that none of that ever happened.
Next week, Legacy profiles one of the country's most successful businessmen, Tony Ryan. And next, this evening, we join Ray Kennedy in the RTE newsroom for a special news update on the Berkeley tragedy. Subsequent programmes will run approximately 5 minutes later than advertised.